Well, good morning if you are in Hollywood, California. Good afternoon if you are in New York City or Boston, Massachusetts. Hello to people all over Europe, Africa, the Americas. Special love and greetings to our loved ones in Ukraine. Stay strong. You have music help you in your struggles, as we know it can. I'm Fred Plotkin. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. And when I do my program, Fred Plotkin on Fridays, which began April of 2020, I like to have people on who inspire me. And my guest today has inspired me for, I think, 40 years, if that's at all plausible or possible. We were babies. And her name is Jane Scovell. And Jane is an author with a specialization, it really is a specialization, in memoirs, autobiographies, some of which she's written with the subject. She's also the author of biographies on her own and other books. Among the figures that she has collaborated with are Elizabeth Taylor, Ginger Rogers, Maureen Stapleton, who many of you may not know, but she was a hell of an actress, Marilyn Horne, greatest opera singer perhaps ever, Kitty Dukakis, wife of the former governor of Massachusetts, and a protagonist in her own life, Nancy Zeckendorf, who was a guest on this program a few months ago, Tim Conway, the comic actor. And she's working now with someone who I know and admire named Brian Large, and I think we'll talk about him. And she's also the author of biographies of the great bass Samuel Ramey, who joined me in May of 2022, and Una Chaplin, daughter of Charlie Chaplin. So Jane, welcome.
Fred, thank you.
It's very good. Yeah. Now you're from, you don't have that much of, yes.
You just said something. I'm going to correct it. She wasn't the daughter of Charlie Chaplin. She
wife.
The daughter of Eugene O'Neill, who married Charlie Chaplin.
You are,
I know it's
that's
just
correct. You're, that's right. Okay.
You can
I'm glad you
cut that
corrected
right
me. Thank you. No. And you are from Brockton, Massachusetts, but I don't say that with a Massachusetts accent. How would you say Brockton, Massachusetts?
Well, let's see. I'll think. Brockton.
Brockton, okay. And
Massachusetts would be Massachusetts.
Yeah, but Brockton, it's a particular sound that people from Massachusetts have. And Brockton has produced a lot of people who are famous in the world of pugilism and boxing and fighting. Rocky Marciano, Marvin Hagler, and then someone named Arthur Mercante. We talk about Arthur Mercante. I have a reason.
Well, he was the referee, I believe, or was he the doctor? I can't remember, but he was
a referee
in Joe Louis era. If I'm maybe not quite as far back as that, but I know he was a ref.
Right. The reason I'm bringing this up is the world is very small. When I was performance manager at the Metropolitan Opera, there was this very kind, friendly stagehand worker backstage who was always well dressed in sort of a tight white shirt and a little bow tie, and he looked like a boxing referee. And I once said to him, his name was Arthur, and I said to him, how come you look like a boxing referee more than a stagehand? And he said, well, I'm Arthur Mercante Jr. My father is Arthur Mercante, the very famous boxing referee who, was involved in many of the great fights in boxing. And Arthur Jr. was the sweetest, kindest. You would never think he came from the world of pugilism in any way, because he was a sweetheart. And he worked very well at the Met for many, many years. He was incredibly reliable. And I just kept thinking to myself that the world really is very small, that the son of one of probably the most famous referee in boxing history would be a stagehand of the Metropolitan Opera.
I,
Anyway, I know about you. Yes, Jane, I know about you that two of your big loves are the movies in Hollywood and
I,
opera. How did that evolve?
well, the movies I was born into. I mean, I'm from that era where movies were everything, and I loved the movies from childhood. I would think nothing. This is where I related very well to Maureen Stapleton. She was a movie nut. I'm a movie nut. So of course is Marilyn Horne. And when I was little, I thought nothing of strolling into the Brockton Theater and just plunking down for two complete shows. And that was a feature film and then a B film and a million shorts and a newsreel and cartoons. It was paradise.
So a B film, for people who don't know, because we have an international audience, is sort of the movie that got lost, that is not considered a classic, but might have been a pot boiler with Linda Darnell, or in other words, not the Betty Davis movie,
Not,
but the
not,
second film,
yeah,
which are often, yeah.
Well, some of them are today's most prized film noirs. They
I
threw
agree.
them out. Yeah, yeah. I think
But at the time, they were thought of as something just to add in during the day in the movie theater.
yeah.
So I want to get to this concept of when you, as someone who was attending performing arts, and we're going to the movies when movies were on the big screen and they had faces then. How have movies evolved for you and cinema evolved for you now that we see them on small screens and streaming, and it's not the experience of attending a film in a theater with other people?
It's funny you should mention that because one of my good friends is Bruce Goldstein. Do you know Bruce from the film
Yeah.
forum? He does the repertoire theater, and he watch a movie on television. Well, yes, of course, and then jump off a penthouse window. This is a sin. And another friend of mine who is been involved, she's a photographer. She too is just absolutely adamant about seeing a movie on a motion picture screen. Well, my friend Mickey, my friend Bruce, I appreciate their point of view. I could watch a movie on the head of a pin. It doesn't matter to me. I mean, granted, I watched Spartacus the other night, and what a thrilling, what a wonderful film that is. But I also have to admit, I think my screen is now 65 inches or whatever. That's pretty big.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, and as far as I'm concerned, if I could cover the whole wall with the screen and stay here and watch it. But you're bringing up a point that I think is very important. There's nothing like going to a movie because there you've got it. You got the popcorn, you got the candy, and in the old days, my gosh, kids don't realize it today. It was such an experience. The ushers, they were like soldiers. They were all in uniform, and you came in. Do you know if they're still doing that at Radio City Music Hall? Do they even show movies there? I can't even.
Very seldom do they show movies at Radio City Music Hall at this point.
Yeah.
But I remember as a kid going to Radio City, and there would be live performances in addition to the movie.
Yeah, yeah.
You'd have the Rockettes come out and dance, and then you'd see a film, and the ushers were beautifully attired, and the hall is gorgeous.
Yeah.
And it's a genuine movie palace. I grew up not far from where you live. I grew up in the Upper West Side of Manhattan at a time when Broadway, the street Broadway, between 66th Street and 107th Street had at least a dozen cinemas. And you'd go to all of these different cinemas, some of which specialized in French films, some of which had sort of the intellectual films like The New Yorker on 88th Street, the Thalia on 95th Street was sort of art films and oddities and so on. And there were two movie palaces, the Riverside and the Riviera on 96th Street, that were among the greatest movie palaces. There was one on 84th Street that's now a sixplex. And there was Cinema Studio on 66th Street, which was tiny. There was a time when the Upper West Side of Manhattan was basically the movie-going capital of the United States. And unfortunately, almost all of that is gone. But anyone who grew up with that has a memory of cinema. There was the Regency on 67th Street, where the Apple Store is now, that when I was a kid, played Belle de Jour by Louis Buñuel with Catherine Deneuve for a year. And people kept going to see Belle de Jour repeatedly. Yeah. And, that kind of presence of cinema, Paris still has it, but very few cities in the world have this devotion to cinema as the seventh art form.
Yeah, but it's funny. At one time, everywhere in America had Brockton. We had in our Main Street, we had 1, 2, 3, 4 theaters, which was quite, surprising. You brought back such memories. I was at Columbia Graduate School in the 50s. And I lived on 59th and 9th, I think. And I would sometimes walk home, a Metro Theater.
Yep.
Always playing the Marx Brothers. And I was going to do my master's thesis on the Marx Brothers. I remember just dropping in, just stroll down, walk back and drop in and whatever Marx
Brothers. The Metro was 99th Street.
Yeah.
And the facade is still there. That was an Art Deco theater. The Olympia was on 107th, and then there was the Plaza Theater on 72nd Street.
Right.
And it was remarkable. And the Beacon on 74th, now a theater for musical performances, but then a movie theater.
Right.
It was remarkable how every 2 or 3 blocks would be another movie theater showing classics and modern films, but not the sort of Cineplex movies, like Cocaine Bear, which may have its merits. I don't know. But
I'm never going to know. I don't think. I have a capacity that goes to the Bowery Boys, and then it's I can't. I don't.
And then, of course, we have to pay tribute to what was known as Lincoln Plaza Cinemas. Toby, and I'm forgetting his last name, on 63rd Street, which was really the anchor of film exploration in New York City, along with Film Forum and IFC, Independent Films. And the Lincoln Center, Film Society of Lincoln Center, which has 3 screens right now and does a very good job. But now that Lincoln Plaza Cinemas is gone, there's something called New Plaza Cinema, in which audience members have formed a collective, and they present films. Such is the passion here for cinema that goes unnoticed by the outside world, who doesn't think of us for that. They think of Hollywood for that, as presenting films. But we in New York used to have all kinds of writers, such as Pauline Kael and Andrew Saris and many others, who would have daily columns, Jay Hoberman, about cinema in the Village Voice, in the New York Times, in Saturday Review. And we would read all of these in the New Yorker, these cinema columns. And, it was a deep part of our city. And I say this, Jane, as an outgrowth to the fact that I believe that cinema is the child of opera. And that when we love what we love about opera in cinema.
Yeah. Nice point.
What did you say? Basically the drama, the issues involved are often the same. The ability of opera to do big pictures on the stage, scenic events on the stage, is remarkable. The only difference is that in opera, music is more of the narrative, words are less of the narrative, but they're important too. Whereas in cinema, the words take more precedence over the music, though the music is incredibly important too.
Yeah.
So I know that you collaborated with various movie stars and actors and so on. Let's talk about Maureen Stapleton very specifically, because most people know Elizabeth Taylor and Ginger Rogers, but Maureen Stapleton, when I was a kid, there were two grand actresses on the New York stage. It was Colleen Dewhurst and Maureen Stapleton. And every year they would have their season where they would arrive in a play, and you went because it was a Colleen Dewhurst play or a Maureen Stapleton play. Never mind what they were doing. It could have been O'Neill, it could have been Neil Simon, it could have been anything. But we went because Maureen Stapleton and Colleen Dewhurst were in these plays. Did you pick her? Did she pick you
I picked,
when it was time to write? You picked her.
I,
Was it hard to persuade her?
uh, I don't think she ever would have done that book, except for the fact that she wanted to make a little money for her grandchildren. That really, but then she sort of got into it. But Maureen was, I loved her. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman, a great actress, and alas, as you know, an alcoholic.
Yeah.
So I found myself many times in the position of running to the local shop to, pick up the wine. It was only wine at that time, which for some reason people who drink think isn't drinking.
Did the alcohol, did the wine loosen the memories? I know she had a, huh?
I'm sorry, she didn't need anything to loosen her memories. She had a superb memory, and she everything was right on. She had a quick wit. She was amazing, amazing. And just very quickly, I saw on the stage only twice. I saw her in Toys in the Attic, and I saw her in the revival of The Little Foxes when Elizabeth Taylor played Regina. And what I remembered, and this was way before I did a book with her, and the scene, Elizabeth came down the stairs, and Maureen, as Bertie, was sitting at the edge of the proscenium with her back to the audience. And that's the scene where Regina lays Bertie waste. I mean, she just, and Elizabeth was brilliant. She was funny. She was wonderful. As she talked, Maureen did more acting with her back than most people. You just saw her fold into that chair. It was, how can I describe it? It was brilliant. It was thrilling. It was, and I really recently saw something that I thought was thrilling on the stage. And that was Donna Murphy in Dear World.
Mm-hmm.
It was at Encores. And if it doesn't make it to Broadway, that's a sin. And that for me captured some of the old glamour of those days when the theater was the theater. But even today, I will carp. I cannot stand the sound systems. I don't like to go to a musical and sit in the orchestra and have the music bubbling into my brain from somewhere other than the stage. Can I be grouchy like this?
Yes, absolutely.
Yippee.
Because I think people younger than we are should know that there was a time when actors on the stage were not amplified.
Yeah.
And they knew how to speak, and they knew how to be heard for 2 hours, 8 performances a week, or 3 hours, 8 performances a week. Maureen Stapleton she was in a play called The Gingerbread Lady, for which she won a Tony Award. I saw her in many things.
Yeah.
Neil, she could do comedy, she could do tragedy. Did she tell you about where she learned how to act, or did this really just come naturally to her?
You know who told me where she learned how to act? Bobby Lewis. Remember, he was one of the founders of the Actors Studio and a director. Mm-hmm. And I went to, this was wonderful. I went to Maureen's 70th birthday I think. And it was in Lenox. She had retired to Lenox. And I had to drive Barbara Cook up.
Oh.
What a strain. And we stayed in a place.
Barbara Cook being a legendary Broadway actress and
Oh,
singer
yeah.
who vanished from the scene for a while and came back quite heavy and built a whole new career, not as the ingenue, but as the wise woman of experience who sang exquisitely well.
Yeah, and we went and we stayed at a place that had been the home of Edith Wharton and Teddy, her husband. And I was in Teddy's room, and Barbara Cook was down the way in Edith's room. And then the next day, we all convened for Maureen's birthday. And I was talking to Bobby Lewis, and Maureen really didn't have much. Well, she loved being part of the Actors Studio, but she was in her own studio. And that's what Bobby Lewis said to me. He said, you know, these people who come to the Actors Studio, they have to find themselves and do this. He said, Maureen was born knowing what to do. She was so natural, so natural. Here's a little plug. I wrote a play about Maureen. I'm still trying to get it done. And a wonderful Kathleen Chalfant, really wonderful.
Yes,
She
wonderful
did
actress.
the stage reading for me. And I'm determined someday, just for Maureen, so people will know who this woman was. Marilyn Horne said, if this were Europe, there would be statues to her.
Yeah.
We don't look at our artists in the same way.
It's true. I think moviegoers, I'm going to name 3 Maureen Stapleton films that they might know her from, but there are many. One, of course, is Bye Bye Birdie, which there are many bawdy stories that era. I don't know if you know any. Do you know any of them? Oh, you do.
Go ahead, please.
You feel able to tell any of them?
Well, yeah, I don't know.
The Anne Margaret one?
Oh God, yes.
Go ahead, Jane. Yes.
Anne Margaret, the young actress who was sensational in Miss Bye Bye Birdie, and there was a party, the after party, and everybody was around, and Anne Margaret was obviously being crowded by a bunch of guys, you know, the money men, I believe Maureen told me, the people who had, and they were all just all over her. And Maureen wanted to rescue her. I have to get this right. And she signaled to her, and she said to her something, honey, why don't you come on over here and be with me? I'm the only one here that doesn't want to fuck you. That's
the story.
And then when years later, she didn't like that story. Maureen didn't like that story because she said it was a put down of Anne Margaret, because the implication, well, I didn't do the setup right, Fred. The setup was everybody got up to make a speech, the producer, the director, and all went on about, I love Anne Margaret. I love Anne Margaret. I love Anne Margaret. And Maureen's remark was, I'm the only one here that doesn't want to fuck Anne Margaret. Sorry. Then she put it right, you know, by saying to Anne Margaret, Anne, I'm sorry. I'm still trying to get that story, you know, shut people up. And Anne Margaret said, don't bother. It's a legend.
Well, you know, in my experience, I've worked more in opera, but I've worked a lot in the theater. Anne Margaret is one of the kindest, most professional artists that I've ever had to work with. She knows everything about the stage. She's a terrific colleague.
Yeah.
Yes, she's very beautiful, been around 80 years old or whatever she is, but it's never been about the beauty. It's the fact that pardon me?
I said,
No, I'm just saying that Anne
they,
Margaret, remains very beautiful and has, is famous for her beauty, but I want to pay tribute also to her professionalism, which is stellar in my experience. It's an artist I've worked with that is just everything you would want as a working colleague, and that's important to say. But Maureen Stapleton, there are two film roles that I think are the most iconic for me. One of them is in Reds, where she won the Oscar, I believe, with Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton.
yes,
And then she was in Interiors by Woody Allen. And Interiors is a film that, for people who would go on the Upper West Side to the New Yorker or wherever and see the latest Woody Allen film, expecting a comedy, expecting it to be irreverent, you walked into that film and it out Ingmar Bergman in
exactly.
terms of it being grim and tragic. And it was probably had a cinematographer who worked with Bergman. And most of the film was gray and in sad colors. And then suddenly in the middle of the film arrives a character named Pearl in a bright red dress, who's a force of nature, who is the second girlfriend of the father of the film, where the first wife committed suicide by walking into the ocean. And suddenly this explosion of color happens. And Maureen Stapleton could have overplayed it. She didn't.
Oh, she's
She
great.
played it as written, and and just wore the red dress. And that was so astonishing because she could have completely subverted the movie and robbed of its tragedy and turned it into sort of a farce. She didn't, because she had a tragedian's understanding of tragedy
She
and
had
drama.
understanding of everything. She
Yeah.
was really bright. She could think intellectually, and but she preferred to bring things down on a very common level. She didn't ever, and she, what she said once, what acting, she said, what is your theory? What did you believe? And she said, my theory of acting, I go to work, I do my job, I get paid, I go home. But I wanted one story. This is not known because it's not in any of the books. But after we did the book, and she was going to do publicity in New York City, and all the publicity had been arranged by Shen Sam, who was Elizabeth Taylor's publicist.
Yep.
And Shen adored Maureen. Everyone adored Maureen. Elizabeth adored Maureen. And so Shen had arranged for her to appear on various shows, and one was a television show. And I went to one with her, and then we were going to another the next day. There was a party at her son's place, and I said to Maureen, well, oh, I know, she was going to be on the QXR show, that wonderful woman that does the show about books, the
June
arts.
LaBelle.
No, that lovely
June
lady.
LaBelle.
No,
Yeah.
no, no. It was, she's
Nimet
still on.
Habashi.
No, 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 no,
Nimet Habashi.
not Nimet. These are all great people, and I wish it were their shows. But
Claire Dalfarez. Candace Agree.
she's still on. She's not music. She's books. Oh God. Anyway, if you got on that show with a book, you were made. And Jen had fixed it up. She got her, and so at the party, I said, "Well, Maureen, I'll see you tomorrow." She said, "What?" I said, "Well, we're going to, QXR." She said, "Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong station. That's why you were mixed up. NPR, NPR.
Okay.
That's the radio station." And she's. I said, "Well, you're going on the what show?" And she said, "No, I'm not." I said, "Maureen, what are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, I asked you," and she said, "I don't have to go." I said, "Maureen, that's like saying goodbye to the sale of 10,000 books."
Yeah.
And she said, I can't. She was terrified. She was terrified of making public appearances. And I'm dying. And I said, "But Maureen, And then all of a sudden, I realized, what was I going to do? Push this woman who was, and I said, forget it, it's okay, it's okay. And then I said to her, which I only asked maybe one other person, I asked her to sign my book. And so she took my book and she signed it. And I go out the door and I open it and it says, to Jane, with all my love, to Dr. Jekyll from Mr. Hyde. She irrepressible. You couldn't. You had to love her. You really had to.
Yeah,
love her.
yeah.
I mean,
she was one of two actresses. There were several, but especially Maureen Stapleton and Colleen Dewhurst. Whatever they were announced for, I bought a ticket. It didn't matter.
You know,
Pardon me?
They were great friends.
I would imagine they were great friends.
Oh, I mean,
they were a similar character.
Yeah, really close. Yeah. And she went berserk when Colleen Dewhurst was told she had cancer, I guess.
Cancer, yes.
But the doctors told her all she needed was surgery. But her mother had been a Christian Scientist, and then suddenly Colleen embraced that and wouldn't do the surgery. And more,
I remember.
Yeah, and alas, she died.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to pay tribute to Colleen Dewhurst as we transition toward opera. One time, I was asked to participate in the constructing of a program at Carnegie Hall, in which I believe, I'm pretty certain if I remember, it was the Boston Symphony doing Strauss's Electra with Hildegard Behrens or maybe Ava Martone. And we said, well, let's have Colleen Dewhurst do a reading of the play Electra before we do the opera. We'll do the opera after the intermission. And Colleen Dewhurst's performance as Electra, just in a dress on the stage of Carnegie Hall, was so riveting that, yes, Behrens and or Ava Martone were magnificent after, and the symphony was magnificent. But the way Colleen Dewhurst set up the story of the opera by reciting the play, you can't, I don't think you can learn what she knew and what Maureen Stapleton knew. And the reason, Jane, that I'm doing this with you is I think it's very important that people such as ourselves document these figures who are a little less remembered now. Yes, we remember Elizabeth Taylor and Ginger Rogers because they're on the screen, and we love them, at least Elizabeth Taylor. But Maureen Stapleton and Colleen Dewhurst are figures
I thought that.
I adored Elizabeth Taylor. Loved her.
Oh,
great woman. And I mean, gorgeous, of course, but a magnificent woman. Really a fantastic person. So, but now let's transition to opera, because you're loved in the opera world. You have written about some of our great figures. We have a mutual friend, Marilyn Horne, who is the top. She's the summit.
Yeah.
And would you talk about how you met Marilyn and how you became involved in writing her book? But I mean, more really about Marilyn Horne herself.
Absolutely. Very quickly, we met at the time in Boston. She was coming to do Carmen. I was on the board of the Opera House. Sarah Caldwell, that's another name nobody knows, but this woman was a major force in opera in Boston in particular. And I was over at the theater about a few days before it was going to open, or a week or so maybe. And I said to Sarah, who's giving the party for Marilyn Horne? And she said, no one. And I said, well, Sarah, because they always, but Marilyn Horne was not such a big star then. Joan Sutherland, 50 people would give a party. And I said, well, someone's got to. And she said, you do it. And I knew who she was. I said, all right. And I said, but I can't have a big bunch of, I'm not equipped. And I remember I called my friend who owned a restaurant, Jacques Noé, and I said, you better get over here. And at that time I was teaching at the College of the Sacred Heart. And I said to my students, who wants an A? and you come, you everything was ready. I get to the opera house, and I saw Sarah up front, and I said, "Oh, Sarah, everything's ready for the party." And she said, "She's not coming." I said, "What do you mean she's not coming? She can't come." She said, she can't. I said, "When did you ask her?" "Well, I just asked her." I said, "Sarah, you can't do that. This is terrible. It's not for me, but I have a lot of A's to give out." And she just, Sarah, and she said, "Well, you ask her." After the opera, she took me back in the Lowe's former movie theater, and I go into the dressing room, and Marilyn Horne was sitting facing the mirror and doing her makeup. And good old Sarah, she said, "Marilyn, this is Jane." At the time, she's got a party for you. And she was out the door before, and Marilyn's going like this. And I said, "Look, Miss Horne, I'm going to level with you. I know Sarah did not ask you, but I prepared this party, and I've been going for a long time. Please, would you please come to this party?" And Marilyn says, I don't go to parties after performances," which I found out later was almost the truth.
Yeah.
She didn't like to go. So then I'm trapped, and I said, "But please, it's not for me, but my friend, he owns a restaurant. He made a cake. It's got Carmen on it. It's got fans and and these students that are and I have to say, Marilyn was she was just as tough as could be, and
Yes.
I didn't stop. And then at one point, I just said, "Please." I was practically on my knees, and she stood up, and like she's up, boom, hits the dressing table. "No," she says, and as she does that, she had this black tea that she liked. The thing flipped up in the air all over the front of my white dress, which I got in Filey's Basement for a real party, but even so. And she this is happening. Shit. And the next thing I know, I'm looking down. She's got her cloth, and she's go, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. What can I do? What can I do?" I said, "Come to my party." And listen, this is for friendship. It's still going on. When you see this,
Yeah.
I told the story. Kill me.
I mean, I have many wonderful stories about her that I can tell. I adore her, let's put it at that. But what I want to pay tribute to her about, and you were witness to this too, is that as she got later into her career, she was very much the mentor to younger artists of all colors at a time when that was not a thing. And she was very inclusive about people who were excluded from the grand world of opera. And I know that she began in her late 50s to think about creating a foundation that was known as the Marilyn Horne Foundation. The song continues about how to take what she knew, not just about opera, but especially about lieder, art songs, and so on, and pass this along, because not only would a younger generation of singers and audiences get to know this music, but it meant that the foundation would send them to small towns in Nebraska or Idaho or South Carolina where artists did not appear to sing and perform. And it brought the music there, but it also gave these artists experience. Because I remember one time Marilyn was, I believe the state was Wyoming, but I could be mistaken. But she said to me that she was going to do a concert in Wyoming well into the career. And I said, "Why?" And she said, "I've sung in 49 states. I've not sung in Wyoming. I'm going to sing in Wyoming." And her commitment to making music a national thing, and not just the capitals of New York and Philadelphia and Boston and LA, where she grew up after her being born in Bradford, Pennsylvania. she was aware of the whole country for music and made a point of bringing music to places where other people just didn't go. And she did it every January around her birthday. She would do master classes and concerts and so on in New York at Carnegie Hall until she retired from that a couple of years ago. Renee Fleming now leads it. It's called the Song Studio. And her legacy to generations of singers is rather remarkable. And I know that very established artists now reach out to her to talk about particular music. Marilyn has given some of her scores to certain artists who she thinks would benefit from having them. Her awareness of being part of the continuum, because she began very young. She sang as a little girl for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When in 1954, they made Carmen Jones, which was the African-American version of Bizet's opera Carmen. It had Dorothy Dandridge and Harry Belafonte. Marilyn, at the age of 20, sang the music of Carmen in English that dubbed Dorothy Dandridge. So she sang for and with Stravinsky when she was a teenager or in her early 20s, just around that time. So the degree of knowledge and experience in that person, from having sung for Franklin Delano Roosevelt to today, is unmatched. And her candor is great. Her political commitment, I believe, is great.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I mean, she puts her money where her mouth is, and she puts her mouth where it can support other people.
Yeah.
And yes, she can be candid, blunt, and no nonsense, but that's part of what I love about her, because you know it's coming from a place of sincerity and not phoniness. If she says, I don't do parties, she doesn't do parties.
Yeah. You know, she is one person, I think, really, yes, I will say this, who, whatever person she's talking to, whatever their position, whether it's the president of the United States or a guy in the railroad station that shines her shoes or something like that, she's the same. She's never put on airs, never. Oh, mind you, she's a diva.
Yes.
Definitely. But everybody is all on the same level for her, and she's on the level with them. It's a wonderful quality. She really is. She's true. She's a true person.
And she was in no way a canceller. She knew that audiences came for her, but even the greatest artists with the best technique occasionally have to cancel. And I remember I was with her at the Met when I was performance manager, and she had to cancel a performance in the middle of the performance. And she called me and she asked me who her cover was, and I told her. And Marilyn took lipstick and used the lipstick to write on the mirror a message of support to the young woman who was coming in to replace Marilyn Horne. And this was before everybody had cameras in their phones. Of course, we would have photographed Marilyn's message in lipstick, but she said to me, I know this girl's going to look at herself in the mirror. She may not look at a paper on the counter. That was practical. And this was when Marilyn was, understandably upset about having to cancel, as any artist would be. Yeah. But nonetheless, the awareness that for someone else this was an important night it spoke volumes to me about who this person is. And she could sing.
By the way, she could sing. She, listen, and she was really funny. Now, when I was she asked me to please come with her to Hamburg, to beg me to come to hear Summer Amadei, because the person who was supposed to accompany her assistant, either she was in between or something. And I said, listen, I'm not, I can't. She said, no, you would just be my friend. You come and stay with me and be, fine, okay. So she had just gotten a copy of the book by Lanfranco Rasponi on the great singers.
Yep.
so it was a suite, there was a living room, and then there were 2 bedrooms off of it. So in the coffee table there, I saw the book and I picked it up and I started reading. She comes in and she says, that's my book. I said, yeah, I know. I was just looking. She said, well, please, I might want to read it. I said, well, sure. So I put it down. And then there were a couple other times that she wasn't around. And I just opened it up and she comes, that's my book. And I said, yeah, I know. One night I couldn't sleep. I got up around 3 in the morning. I go in, the book is on the thing. I pick it up, I open it up, written on the first page. This book is the property of Marilyn Bernice Horn, not Jane Scovell. I had more fun with that one. And then got to hear her sing.
Yes.
No?
Yeah. Arsace, is that the name of I think the name of the character that she sang in Semidamide is also.
Yeah. Do you know the
and
story?
And Semidamide sings Arsace qui verrà. Yeah. Yeah, it's spectacular. I mean, if I had to pick my favorite Marilyn Horne performance, I don't think I could, but Semidamide would be right up there.
For me, it's right up there too. Also because I heard her sing it. Oh, gosh, what? It's a long time ago and I'm forgetting, but when you said Arsace, I got to tell you, when the internet came in at first, I picked a box J at our that was mine, and so she had chosen hers, and then she called. We were talking, and she said, "Jane, everybody's writing on my internet. They keep saying, is this Marilyn Horne? Is this Marilyn Horne?" I said, "Well, what's your sign in your?" She said, "Arsace 1." Jack, do you think maybe people might associate you with that, perhaps more than anyone else? No one else was singing it, and everybody was writing, "Is this Marilyn Horne?" Yes, it was Marilyn Horne.
Actually, I want to go back to a topic you raised. It relates to Marilyn and to other people. I don't think many people remember now who Sarah Caldwell was.
Yeah.
And now, finally, much belatedly, we are seeing more than just one woman conductor on podiums around the world in opera houses and symphonies. We are well overdue. Yeah. But Sarah Caldwell was doing this decades ago. I think it's fair to say that she looked like Benjamin Franklin in a dress.
Absolutely. I thought I was the only one who noticed that.
Oh, no, she looked exactly like Benjamin Franklin with the half glasses, and she looked like Benjamin Franklin in a dress. She also overworked a lot, and she would get her sleep where she could. And I remember one time I was doing something at the New York State Theaters, it was then known, and she was conducting the New York City Opera. And I was leading dignitaries who wanted to give money to the company into the theater, and we walked on the second tier, and we passed a woman who looked dead on the floor. And this was Sarah Caldwell napping between which she had 20 minutes to nap. And she was the kind of fundraiser, if you handed her $5 for the company, she'd take the money. And there she was, stretched out on the floor with dollar bills next to her. And people, the rather Tony people who wanted to give money said, "Who is that?" I said, "That's Sarah Caldwell. She's tonight's conductor. She's resting." And they said, "Don't they have a room backstage for her?" And I said, "They do actually, but I think she's just more comfortable here." What could I say? But she was highly eccentric. But she was a leader in music at a time when women were not in positions of authority. And you imitated her voice perfectly.
Thank you.
Yeah. But talk about Sarah Caldwell for history. I think we should document her a bit.
I'd be happy to. My brother Alan was on the board of the opera company, and then I decided that I wanted to do it too. And he said to me, "Okay, Jane, come on, but don't you ever, ever sign your name to a check or anything to do. I said, okay. And that was a very good advice. And so I came, and Sarah, I mean, Sarah was a scamp in many ways. It didn't matter what she did, but if it had to be done, it had to be done to get the opera going. And so one accepted her modus operandi. She did a production of the Trojans, which I have to say, I think was better than the one at the Met. She got these Helen Pond and Herb Sen. They were set designers and so forth. They did amazing things. One production I'll never forget, Renata Tebaldi was coming, and this young guy from the City Opera, nobody heard of him, Placido something or other. And it was a bohème, and I can't remember the fellow who did the set, but it was beautiful. It was outside on, it just was unbelievable. And I used to go to rehearsals all the time. And I went to one rehearsal, and Tebaldi, who was just over the cusp, she was not at her greatest, but she, not at her greatest, was greater than anybody. And she was coming to do, I dropped my key and this and that and the other thing, and knocking on the door. And Sarah was in the audience. She called, Madam Tebaldi, excuse me. And Sarah gets up and walks up and claps. Thanks, Fred, for encouraging me. Who can I imitate? Sarah Caldwell. So, and Sarah goes marching up the stage, and Tebaldi had, fallen, and was like, she said, I think it would be a little better, just step aside. If you did it more like this. And Sarah taps on the door, and then, but I mean, whopped to the ground. The dust cloud that went up, you couldn't see either of them for a little while, and she just lay there. And Tebaldi said, I see. Great moment, great moment. I owe everything in my life practically to Sarah Caldwell, because it was through my knowing her that I got to know first Beverly Sills. And then Marilyn. So the only thing I'll say about Sarah was Sarah was interested in Sarah and opera, not necessarily opera. And she never laid groundwork for some kind of company. I think they do have one now that
Boston Lyric Opera,
Yes, and so forth. But
well, part of that, Jane, and maybe speak to this, my theory is that certain cities such as Boston and Cleveland never fully developed opera traditions, even though they're great musical towns, because the Metropolitan Opera came on tour there every year, whereas other cities, especially Dallas, but then later Atlanta and Minneapolis, did develop opera companies. Dallas for a very long time, but Atlanta and Minneapolis came on later. But Boston and Cleveland, notoriously, they have two of the greatest orchestras in the world and wonderful theaters for music, and yet never developed an opera tradition of homegrown opera companies. So when you were a girl and a young woman in Boston, did you go to the Met every spring when the Met came?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you're exactly right, because we always could look forward to the Met's visit, and we had an opera house, which during the time that just as Sarah was starting, they pulled it down, and for no good reason, I assure you. And I remember we on the board, or members of the Guild, I was also a member of the Guild, and we went out and we were all in various costumes from operas, and we all stood there with hard hats on and in costume, and that was on maybe the front page of the Boston Globe, the end of and the rubber was all around us. If we hadn't had the Metropolitan Opera, I think they would have developed an opera.
I mean, it's a city with great universities and a lot of money, and culture. It's known as the Athens of America. And one would think that Boston would have a great opera tradition. It doesn't quite in the same way that,
No.
San Francisco does, or Cleveland or Chicago, even.
May have been a Boston Opera
I mean,
Company.
Cincinnati. Yeah. Yeah.
Long ago, because one of the reasons we had to call it, she called it the Opera Company of Boston, is that she couldn't call it the Boston Opera Company. And I do believe, but it was people like Caruso coming and singing, not with the Met. I think. I don't want to.
Right. One would, I mean, geographically, it's close enough to New York that an artist appearing at the Met could come to Boston or Philadelphia, where they did somewhat.
You went to New York or Hartford. They used to go to Hartford, Connecticut.
Yeah. I've known many Bostonians who come to New York most Saturday afternoons for their opera live at the Met rather than going in Boston. It's very particular that. I want to talk to you about two other people. One of them is, I mean, to say that I adore Samuel Ramey, that's hardly original. But Samuel Ramey is such a sensational artist and a great man. And he lived about 3 blocks from me when he was living in New York and at the Met and City Opera and so on. And I'd see him out on the streets, and he has a sort of Kansan glamour that he's very charismatic. He's from Kansas in the Midwest, in a place called Colby, Kansas, that even Kansans are hard put to identify where is Colby, Kansas. And he came from there. He really took the opera world by storm, first at New York City Opera and then everywhere. And while, excuse me, he too is certainly a man of strong opinions, he also is a fabulous artist, as a singer, as an actor. He's someone with very strong political opinions, most of which I agree with. And talk about Sam Ramey, because here's someone you chose to write a book about rather than collaborate with.
Yes, that partly was because I wasn't sure whether I could capture the voice. That's very important when you're doing, you really want to sound like the person and so forth and so on. If you could get 2 words out of Sam in those days, you were lucky.
And by voice, you mean speaking voice, not singing voice.
How they sound. I mean, the written word is a lot different from the spoken word. And ideally, if you're doing your job right, you make that written word sound like that person speaking. And I thought it would be easier. So, but he was perfectly fine with it. And I have to say, I thought that book was good, and I think I can say these kinds of things. Yeah, I'm right. When I did my corrections and simple things like even Italian, and I don't really speak Italian, but I made sure that the words were written right and everything. And when they were got wrong, I corrected and sent everything in. I cropped pictures. I did this and that and the other thing. When it was published, that was not. No one paid any heed, and I was chastised for Italian that wasn't right, written wrong, and the words. It makes you feel like a jerk. But anyway, I feel that Sam. I hope he wasn't shortchanged, because I think the book was good. The idea that man has not been given the Kennedy Medal yet is really ridiculous. He was the finest. My God, he could do anything. The Rossini, who could sing that? Nobody.
And Russian works, Prokofiev and
and
Mozart. I mean, basses I know all say to me, yeah, I'm good at what I do, but I'm not Samuel Ramey.
Right.
The greatest bassists have said this to me, and they all talk about Sam as being particular. Jane, it's interesting you speak about the Kennedy Center honor. A number of years ago, I wrote an article saying that, while certain of our finest American singers, including Leontine Price and Marilyn Horne and Beverly Sills and Joan Sutherland, Luciano Pavarotti, who are not Americans, and Placido Domingo, and later Jesse Norman and Grace Bumbry, Martina Arroyo have all been honored, and I love them all. But I wrote an article saying that it was a huge oversight that Samuel Ramey has not yet been given the Kennedy Center honor. And Sam got in touch with me and he said, "Thank you for the article, but you're not correct. The person who should get it before me is Frederica von Stade."
Sam, that's Sam in a nutshell.
That is Samuel. I'm getting goosebumps because in a way
Yeah.
he's correct. I don't want to say before, but for him to point out to me that there is another artist who deserves it, and Frederica von Stade absolutely deserves it, that's gentlemanly, but it's also an awareness of the quality of another artist.
They appreciate, this was the great thing about the chemistry between him and Marilyn Horne. And she said the same as he, and I was privileged enough to hear both of them say the same thing. When they were on the stage together, it was like a duel. And they just, it was like Basil Rathbone and Errol Flynn, they were just right at each other. And this one and that parry, and giving to each other and take, it was thrilling. When do you get thrilled anymore?
Well, Samuel Ramey made a rather spectacular Met debut when I was working there, I believe December 1984, if memory serves. It was in Handel's Rinaldo, and I think the character was named Assur, and Marilyn played Rinaldo.
Right.
And there was a lovely soprano in it named Benita Valente, who I adored, and then in later performances, Carol Vaness making her Met debut. I mean, it was a rather astonishing production, and the Met's first Handel. And magnificent though Marilyn was as Rinaldo, the person who got the most coverage that night was Samuel Ramey's debut. It just was the most spectacular singing by a bass that I think I've ever heard.
I agree with you.
Certain things by Ferruccio Furlanetto and James Morris, but basically those three.
And I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
But do you remember that when he made his big entrance and he was in a chariot and fell off the axle as he was about to sing, and the whole audience, and he doesn't, he sings.
Sibilar was the first notes, and the crowd went wild.
Yeah.
The crowd really went wild.
Fred,
and,
I want to interrupt you because I got to get this story out.
Okay.
That night, it was a big opening. There were very few tickets, if any. My daughter, Amy, announced to me she wanted to go. And I said, "Dear, I'm sorry. There's not enough tickets. I just haven't had it." And she said, "Okay." And I said, "But if you come to the house," and you were, commanding the things in the front of the house, I said, "Fred Plotkin, go ask Fred, and maybe, and I don't know if you remember this, but I went to you and I said, "Fred, if my daughter comes, give her a little bit of a hard time," just for fun. Because Amy, she can walk in anywhere. And I remember sitting there and I was feeling bad because Kurt was coming. There was no Amy. And then all of a sudden I see her coming down the aisle, smiling. And by the way, P.S., quite a few rows ahead of me. I guess someone had turned or something like that. And I always remember, I was going to go get you. I told you to give her trouble, but you waited so long, I was getting worried.
I did give her trouble. Just enough to make her understand that, I don't just do this for anyone.
No. I told her.
And that, something like attending the premiere of, and I know she understood. So it's not a problem.
Yeah.
So before we get to the last subject, who's the one you're working on now, I want to ask you, how did you get into writing books? You were a teacher and you were on boards and so on, but when did your career as a writer begin?
Well, I had written for newspapers. I wrote in Boston. I had a column called Plain Jane, I want you to know. And I'd written for the Globe and the Herald. God, all those old papers. And then I did a lot for the underground press, Boston After Dark and the Phoenix. And I did food reviews, I did movie reviews, I did opera reviews, anything. I reviewed everything. And the first, well, it's a long story and I can't really, but let's put it this way. Steve Rubin, I think you know Steve.
Publicist, yeah.
No, publisher.
Well, I'm sorry. His wife Cynthia was publicist. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
And she was a publicist. Steve was approached by Cynthia, his wife, called me and said, listen, you know Marilyn Horn, would you put in a good word because Steve has been suggested to do a book with her? And I said, of course I will. And I remember thinking, damn it, why didn't I think of that? And so I just called Marilyn right away and I said, gee, you know, Steve, she knew who he was, but I said, he's great. You know, she said, oh, thanks, okay, that's it. I don't hear anything. Months later, I said to Cynthia, well, so what's happening with the book with Marilyn Horn? She said, oh, he's not doing it. I said, he's not doing it? And she said, well, yeah, and I'll be frank, he couldn't get enough money. And I said, why didn't you tell me? She said, why should I tell you? And then she said, why? Would you have wanted to do it? I said, yeah. She said, well, why didn't you say something? I said, really? Steve was doing the book. What was I going to say? She said, okay. Well, anyway, they contacted the agent and the agent contacted me and I did a proposal and I got, well, Steve, this is the true story. I got more money than Steve, but Ronaldo had happened. The publicity was out, and that's all you need to sell a book. And so that's how I started. It was in biography. It was with her.
I think, I mean, you wrote a biography, and this is when I came to know you, of someone I knew very well already and had worked with and been emotionally intimate with, and she with me and so on. And one of the things I loved in the book is you really captured that person. And Marilyn.
Oh, you're talking about Marilyn. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Her candor, her bluntness, but her compassion, and all of that really came out, but it didn't come out as if she was self-promoting, but just the way the story was told spoke of her heart very much. And that's, you produced on the page the person I knew.
Thank you.
And I've not had many experiences where I read biographies or autobiographies of people I've known where they sound like the person on the page.
That's what.
Although I will mention another one. This is controversial. This was self-written by Jessie Norman. Her book, I think it was called Stand Up and Sing. Her book was pilloried by the critics and the media and so on. But that voice in there, that writer's voice, was Jessie Norman. It was the completely authentic Jessie Norman. Whatever we make of that is something else. But I told her that I felt there was real honesty in the book. And I pointed out to her something that I knew about Jessie Norman that a lot of people didn't know immediately, was that born in 1945, she grew up not just as an African-American person in the South, but as a woman, a girl and a woman in the South, at a time when African-American women, there were fewer expectations of them than their brothers. And she was in a middle-class family, and the brothers were expected to go on to professional careers. She was interested in medicine, and that was entirely discouraged. But she happened to be able to sing pretty well. And when you read that book, you understand that it was Jessie Norman as a woman who was writing this book rather than Jessie Norman as a Black person. Obviously, she was a Black person and was proud of that, as she should be, but she wrote it as a woman. And that, to me, was the key to that book that a lot of people didn't understand, because they expected her to address being a symbol for Black people, of being fat, which she was, obviously. But she sort of, no pun intended here, skirted the issue of being fat.
Skirting.
In about a page and a half. And that was it. And that was all she felt she had to deal with in that topic.
Fred.
And that was fine. Yeah.
Yeah, You know, Canyon Ranch, up this place up in
A
Lenox.
weight loss place, yeah.
Well, it's a spa. Okay.
A spa.
They gave me, thank you, Canyon Ranch. They gave me free time up there when I was working with Maureen because she was up the street.
Hmm.
So I remember I was there and Jesse Norman was there.
Yep.
And there was a little room that off somewhere that they showed you, and you opened the door and there was a bed on one side and a bed on the other side. And they said, if you're ever tired, you could just come in here and lie down. And you know, I very rarely was tired, but one day I was tired. So I went in and I lay down, and then the door opened and Jessie Norman walked in. She lay down on the other cot. And I know I shouldn't have, but I said, would you sing me a lullaby?
And
It
did
was
she
so great.
pull out her best Brahms?
I wish I could say she sang it. I could lie. No, she said, I'm sorry. I'm tired. I said, forgive me. I don't. It was just a little joke. But
Guten Abend, gute Nacht. So the last person before we go that I want to talk to you about, you are now working on a book with a man that I revere named Brian Large. And Brian, I think it's fair to say, is modest about being a genius and being a
yes,
trailblazer. And he's gentlemanly, he's quiet. Brian, along with a couple of other people, was really the trailblazer in creating opera on video. And we're concluding here. I began by asking you about your loves of cinema and opera. Brian Large is the person more than anyone else I've ever known who has brought the best of cinema and the best of opera together in a way that is not opera, it's not cinema, it's something else, but it's not simply capturing a performance with lots of camera work. It's, in my experience of Brian, he would, if he's doing, say, Die Walküre, he would look at the score and understand what Wagner intended with the lyrics and with the music, and then capture on film that. And if he's working, say, with James Morris and Hildegard Behrens, he may do something that was at the time unconventional. Now it's common, of putting a camera on the stage and getting a reaction shot, a two-shot, of how Brunhilde listens to her father Wotan as Wotan has to put her to sleep and build magic fire. Brian could capture the whole stage, but a lot of things he did are not done now. In other words, now they're very fast shots all the time, and your eyes are going back and forth like watching a sports match. Brian Large's version of opera on film, on video, is that you're watching the way you would in the auditorium, not on television. And I got to work with him a fair amount in the 80s at the Met because we did a lot of live broadcast to Europe, to the States, on television, not opera in HD. The technology was in no way what it is now in terms of lighting and cameras, and therefore he had to be a lot more inventive to create the videos, the films, whatever we want to call them, that he did. But they were extraordinary. So how did you persuade the modest but brilliant Brian Large to do a book with you? And how's it going?
first I want to say I love Brian Large. This man is just incredible. Fred, he's everything you say. He's so modest. You know, the man has a PhD in music, has a PhD in philosophy. He studied conducting. He was a conductor and he was quite a fine pianist. He's a musician through and through. And when he came along, they had, everything was standard. He started out at the BBC, I'm sure you know, but, and everything was like 3 cameras, center and both sides, and the show go over and then pan back. He was the one who started, they asked him when he was applying for job at the BBC, how he would handle music of this happened to be something, I don't want it's too much detail, but he said, I would look for an attractive young woman in the audience, and I would see what she was doing with her facial expressions and reactions, and I would set that shot.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, he really was the breakthrough man. He put the music into the shot, and everyone knows that. And the color. He did. You know, he had a great friendship with which was quite something with Benjamin Britten, and and
Yes,
and Britten wasn't. He wasn't an easy guy. He was wonderful, and
he
I mean,
was prickly. Yeah.
he had his prick sleeves.
Mhm.
He and he Brian did things for him that just, you know, Britain was just so thrilled, and they be working close together, knowing, using television, which he calls, you know, television magic, that the things you could do with television that you cannot do on stage. And one funny quick one was that when they did Owen Wingrave, and
Mhm.
it's kind of a ghost story in a way, and uh, television, you know, you just cut to the next scene. And then Britton said to Brian, well, you know, I got to start writing the interlude music. And Brian said, but you don't need interlude music because we don't have an interlude. And Britton said, no, I don't want to write the break. And he kept insisting. And Brian said, well, why do you want to write it? He said, well, look, this is going to be done on the stage afterwards, and they're going to need interlude music. So
Mhm.
why don't I do it while I'm doing it now? Very
Yeah.
practical. And he
Yeah.
did. And it
Mhm.
was. Um, he sees things. I'm enjoying this book so much that I don't want to stop writing it. So I've been dragging it along. He did the Horowitz in Moscow
Yeah.
video, which I didn't even know he had done it. And I watched it. I said, God, this is amazing. And then, of course, he did the three tenors, the first one.
Mhm.
And everything he did, you don't think about it when you watch a television show. You barely think about it when you watch a movie. But when you start thinking about how this shot is set up, what's down, which camera is doing it, this and that, it all flows. And it's
Yeah.
musical. That's the thing, because he knows his music. And
Yeah.
he is the nicest. I love him. He's a great man. Buy this
The
book.
three tenors were, if I recall, July 5th of 1990 or something very close to that in Rome. It was the final of the soccer or the football
Yeah,
World Cup.
yeah.
And I happened to be there because I was friends with the three tenors in different ways. We had different kinds of friendships, but I knew all three. And they just kind of wanted me around to help because they knew that I would, and I speak Italian. And so I was there and I watched Brian from a distance because I wanted to learn what he did. But on the other hand, wanted to be available to the three guys who, if they need anything, but they were fine. But Mr. Carreras had been ill and everybody was being very careful about that. And he was fine. He had leukemia, for people who don't know, and he successfully beat it. But this was one of his first appearances after fighting leukemia. And Brian was so attuned to the weather, to the distinguished audience, to the event, to the moment, and completely calm, or at least he looked calm. And I try to be around masters as much as I can and watch and learn, in part because I like to learn, but in part because I think one of my skills is transmitting what I've learned to other people. And therefore, I very actively pay attention. And I had certainly watched him work a lot at the Met in the 80s when I was there, but I'd left the Met by then. And to see him work in Rome in another context that was not the controlled professional atmosphere of the Met, but the rather freewheeling live concert performance for billions of people watching, and all the emotional tension and Zubin Mehta conducting and the whole thing. It was remarkable what he did, the way he captured, if I watch it now, 30 plus years later, the event that I remember.
Oh, he would, you know, apropos, he was offered for years all the succeeding ones. He would not do it. And believe me, that was big, big money
Yeah.
because he said, I did it the best I knew how. And he said, I wanted that to stand. And I knew that you can't sustain that kind of thing. You know, it ran its course and that he would never, never do it again. He has, you know, a word that's really out of fashion. It's called integrity.
Yeah.
This is a man who really VC Dartes all over the place.
Mhm.
And by the way, when I told him I was going to be on, he said, pleased to send you his very best.
Thank you. And I'll send him an email.
I
But
learned so much from him.
I have a question. Well, that relates to my question. You learn what you learned from him. We were speaking before about Marilyn Horne and how part of her mission and her desire is to transmit and pass on what she knows to singers. And not only, she points at arts managers to say this won't be good for this theater, that kind of thing. But can what Brian Large knows be taught, or is it really sui generis to him?
Anybody can be taught it, but how they pass it on is probably uniquely Brian because he is everything. He is kind. He's a gentleman and he has a fabulous sense of humor.
Yeah.
He is great. You know, it's that British kind of humor, which is just as delightful to work with him.
Mm-hmm.
And his generosity, he's got that real generosity of spirit.
Yeah.
And he explains things that even I can understand it. And he's made me so aware of things that I never even thought about before. You know, just sit down and his integrity and his musicality. It's just amazing, amazing.
I want to tell listeners that most of them know by now that I asked my guests to pick things from the Adagio catalog. They will be attached to the show page. They're what you would expect, but they're all great. Marilyn Horne, Maria Callas, Samuel Ramey, the Wagner Ring Cycle conducted by George Schulte, Vladimir Horowitz playing Scarlatti, and the Archduke Trio. Why the Archduke Trio? Is it the musicians or is it the music itself?
Combination.
Okay.
Thurman, Rubinstein, and Heifetz.
Yep. Heifetz. Yep.
Heaven.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's their classic. The everything, you know, like that, and beneath it, the passion. I mean, oh God, it's just. I'm crazy about all three. I never dated them, but I'm really crazy.
Final question, Jane. We were talking about Brian Large and Marilyn Horne and what they know and how they pass it on. You have a unique resume and life experience and what you know about conveying information, about doing it in a factual but also humorous and humane way. What can you teach and pass this on, or is it unique to you? This knowledge of how to create worlds in your books that are the worlds of people, but also of history and of culture.
Oh, I will say one thing, and then I want to close with tell you a story that someone once asked me, you know, what to do, how to write it, and I said, the main thing is this: listen and say it the way the person is saying it. You know, when you put down the words, you can see maybe they made a mistake in English or they did this wrong or they used the wrong word. For the most part, you know, you don't want them to make a fool of themselves. And sometimes people are talking fast and, you know, they wouldn't do it. But don't start correcting them or putting it the way you would say. It always has to be true to what that person said. Mm-hmm. Here's a story by Ginger Rogers. When I started working with her, I said,
I was about to say,
I know you like, and I have that picture. Anyway, uh, she was asking her about Fred Astaire. And I said, Fred, was there anything going on with you and Fred? And she said, no. That he came, I was leaving Broadway, I was going to Hollywood, and we went out together, and he picked me up in a chauffeured limousine. We went to the casino in the park and we danced. We came back. He gave me a sweet little kiss goodnight, and I went on, and then I was off to Hollywood. Okay, so I went home and I had a Fred's autobiography, Steps in Time, and I look at it and I read. Ginger Rogers and I dated for quite a while. I would go over to her mother's home and she would make dinner for us. And then we would go dancing at the casino in the park and horseback riding in Central. It was the whole thing. The next day I went in and I said, hey, Ginger, you remember yesterday when you told me that you and Fred only went out once and that you went off to Hollywood? She said, yes. And I said, well, I read Fred's book last night, and Fred said that you went out together quite a bit. And so she said, so? And I said, well, what is it? Did you go out with him a lot or just once? And she looked at me and she said, it's my book. That's the answer. It was her book, and it was the way she saw it. I'm not writing the history of the Napoleonic Wars. It's not necessary that I get it. I try to get everything right, but sometimes it's the way people remember it. And especially if you're doing it in that person's voice, you have got to say what they want you to say.
I was never her biggest fan, but she was a better actress than I think she's given credit for in all kinds of genres and not just dancing. There was a film, I'm forgetting the titles. I beg your pardon?
Do you know The Major and the Minor?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
I think why isn't that a musical?
It so should be. Yeah. But there's another film that I've seen a couple of times, but only recently, and I forget the title, but it co-stars Cary Grant. It was directed by Howard Hawks, and it's about Cary Grant as a scientist in a lab where they're dealing with monkeys, and some kind of potion goes into the water. Pardon me? Monkey business, yeah. And Marilyn Monroe has a very small role in the movie and played a very great, I think, Charles Coburn or someone like Charles Coburn. Right. And Ginger Rogers was brilliant as a comedian. Great. I mean, Lucille Ball had nothing on her in that movie. The way she played every moment, and these because in a way it was like bringing up Baby with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, but updated to post-war with monkeys instead of leopards. And but it's a brilliant film, and Cary Grant customarily was a wonderful comic actor and supportive and so on. But she was every bit as good. She was, with Marilyn Monroe, gorgeous, but Ginger Rogers just was cool, and she's the one who made that movie for me, not the others.
It's very interesting because she really was good. She really was a good actress. And I asked her once, I said, Ginger, who do you think was the better dancer, you or Fred? And she thought, she says, well, my taps were better. Okay. She was a little tougher to take, though.
I can imagine.
But if you got, she met me at the airport. She was in a wheelchair, Fred. She'd had an accident, and she brought flowers and everything else. Like I was a movie star that was coming out there, and she had a good sense of humor. Mm-hmm. But she was all wrapped up in that Hollywood. Her mother was in a wholesale. Yeah.
Yes, I know. Well, listeners, read Jane's book about Ginger Rogers tomorrow, but not just that.
Read them all.
The opera lovers start with Marilyn Horne and Samuel Ramey. The movie lovers and acting lovers start with Maureen and then Ginger, I think. but there are so many wonderful books. I had Nancy Zeckendorf on recently,
right?
and I just want to ask you one question about that I will not reveal, but there is a big surprise that comes in the book that she addressed briefly. And when you know that the book will have a big surprise that will perhaps make news and so on, how do you, as a writer, build toward a surprise? And we're not giving away the surprise. How does that happen creatively, that you know how to tell the story in a way that when the surprise comes late in the book, you say, oh, but of course, but I didn't see it coming.
I'm wondering what it is. I did such a good job.
Mr. Bing.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when you're doing something like that, you want to make sure that people are not alive, that are not going to be affected or whatever it is. And you better make sure that the story is fact.
Mm-hmm.
And Nancy was the only one who really is left that gives a hoot,
Yeah.
because the other person involved did not have children and so forth and so on. And she was willing to come forth with it. And
Mm-hmm.
there have been times that people have wanted to say things in books which I didn't think they should. It happened with Maureen, but I'm obligated to put things down. And the editor, when I handed the editor, said, "This is not going in." I said, "Thank you." So you have someone, but to set it up, you have to. Well, you start writing. You'll sow the seeds here, then you'll take it over there and pull it. Can you pull it a little longer? Is it going to have the best impact in this sentence, or maybe 2 pages back? It's juggle a little bit.
Yeah.
And I knew it was a big, but you know what? It's a funny thing, Fred. It's yesterday's headline. And
Mm-hmm.
nobody even knows who anybody is. And so
Yeah.
it had come out a year or so afterward, then, that would be, wow. I mean, I would have fainted,
Sure.
but it's funny.
But I think, as I've said to you before, I think that you and I and what we do in our different ways, it's really vital, because I don't have any access to grind. I don't think you do either.
Oh,
But I feel that it's very important that we, as people who are experienced and expert on certain topics, preserve knowledge and experience of these people that we admire, or if we don't admire them, at least we respect them. But, had you not done a Samuel Ramey book, I would have tried to, because I just think the world of him. And, there are people like that who, because he's a modest man too,
exactly.
he would never have done that book. And, the example we gave where he corrected me that, yes, maybe he should get a Kennedy Center honor, but first Frederica von Stana says everything about who that man is.
Exactly. Yeah. I
Yeah.
love
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's another thing, Fred. I never worked with anybody that I didn't like. I maybe in a rare instance I came to not like, but say that when I started out, I turned down a number of books because because I wasn't interested in doing the book, because I didn't particularly care for the person. And
I have too. Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad who
Yeah.
wants to be around someone you don't like?
No, because we live with these people. They become first name, even if they're dead, they become first name people in our lives, and we think about them all the time. And I don't want to live with someone who I don't really respect or care for. There are great artists who I would respect their artistry, but I don't connect to them personally, and so I don't think that I can bring out their person
Right.
in a way that is fair. And I'm not here to do a hatchet job on anyone.
No,
That's
that's
just not.
feeling about I love what you do, because it's really great to see these artists and people just being themselves and responding, and it's quite wonderful, quite wonderful.
Thank you. I'm occasionally asked, who don't you like? And I will say, well, you won't see those people on my show. There are many people who have not been on my show that I would love to have, and I eventually I hope to get them, or in articles, or at teaching at New York University. But there are certain very few people who I will just never ask. I mean, I'll give an example, not by name. There's a conductor who is well thought of. His work doesn't turn me on. So it would never occur to me to have that conductor in conversation, because I would not be fully sincere if I said, I love the way you did this or that, or the way you worked with a particular singer. He doesn't do it for me. That doesn't mean he's not good. It just means that taste is personal, and he doesn't do it for me. But if he does it for other people, great.
I admire you for that, and I admire myself for that too. I think it's
Yes, you should.
I think you should do. Why
Yeah.
work with somebody that doesn't appeal to you, or
Yeah.
is it money? Well, yes, and
Yeah.
but yeah, but money isn't everything.
It's going back to the Brian Large example, integrity.
Yeah, I
And
would go to the ends of the earth for Brian Lodge. This is a man that is the finest gentleman I know.
well, I look forward to reading that book and everything else that you do, Jane Scovell. And I thank you for joining me. And I thank you for all of our years of friendship and collegial supportiveness, which is a good thing too. And we don't always see it, but we have done it, I think. And I look forward to seeing you soon in life on the streets of New York, or maybe in theaters, or for tea. That would be lovely.
It'll
Jane,
happen.
thank you very much.